welcome back. According to my notes, it's going to be a little bit shorter this week. We'll actually see if it's any shorter, but that's what it says on my end of things. Before we get started, I had a fun fact for you guys. Did you know that before astronomers settled on a light year, they actually considered for a short time using the name of this class to measure the distances in outer space? True story. I know last week I left off and said we were going to talk about shame, but I actually pushed that off to next week. Next week we'll tackle shame and trauma more in depth. Because this is week 4, which means we're a third of the way through this class, I really haven't given you guys anything that's not super abstract. We've talked about sociology and psychology, but it's really been the abstract side of things. So I wanted to take this week and actually talk about the more practical side of things. So I have 3 actual practical tools that you can use in your life. Our first one is going to come from Every Man's Battle. All right? And we're going to use the term sexual purity. And real quick, I want to throw this out. This isn't a them thing. This is a me thing. I'm not a huge fan of that term. Not because I think there's anything wrong with those terms. I think purity is as a word, does what it's supposed to do. You think of words like gold is pure, or like there's a verse, be blameless and pure, right? Like sexual purity. In that context, I'm okay with the word. But the phrase sexual purity has been used by a lot of different groups with lots of different philosophies and lots of different methods. And so when I hear the term sexual purity, I immediately go back to the 80s and 90s, that same kind of just say no attitude of if you're struggling with sexual issues, then you're just not trying hard enough. And that's not our approach here. So the first thing we should do then is how are we going to use this term? And I'm going to read right out of Every Man's Battle here for just a minute. And we're going to start with the definition. They say, you are sexually pure when no sexual gratification comes from anyone or anything but your wife. Purity means stopping sexual gratification that comes to us from outside our marriage. How do we stop it? We're able to draw outside sexual gratification from only 2 places, the eyes and the mind. Therefore, to be successful in the battle for our sexual perimeter, we must blockade the quote-unquote shipping lanes of the eyes and mind. Beyond that, we also want to make sure that we have a healthy, positive affections and attitudes in our relationships with our wives. In other words, we want our hearts to be right. That means your objective in the war against lust is to build 3 perimeters of defense in your life, right? With your eyes, in your mind, and in your heart. Now, really quick, I want to say that those 3 ideas, the perimeters of your eyes, your mind, and your heart, is a big chunk of this book. Probably not quite half, but probably a third, maybe a little less, maybe between a quarter and a third of this book is just talking around those ideas. So we're not going to cover all of them, though we'll probably try to hit some more of these ideas in a later week. Today we're just going to talk about your eyes. And beyond that, I should clarify this. When they talk about the battle of your eyes in the book, they actually break it down even further into 4 different battles. They say you have to learn to bounce your eyes, to starve your eyes, and then they talk about taking up a sword and a shield. And we're not going to cover any of that. We're just going to cover the first one. So, there it goes. So they use the terminology a covenant with your eyes, which I think is actually pretty appropriate because Pastor Ryan just talked about covenants on Sunday. And so a covenant is a biblical promise, and it can be a one-way promise, like I'm just going to promise to do something, or it can be a deal. And so a one-way promise, I always go to the example of Noah. Like God sends the flood, and then he makes a covenant with Noah, and God says, I'm never going to do that again. And Noah doesn't have to do anything in return, right? It's not a deal. It's just a God saying flat out, I'm not going to do that again. And you can contrast that with the covenant with Moses, where he says, like, all right, here's the deal. I'll be your God, and you have to be my people. All right, this is a two-way street promise now. And so when I first came across this, I was actually kind of surprised. Well, yeah, I was surprised because it wasn't where I was expecting them to talk about having a covenant with your eyes. If you're thinking about sexual lessons, let's say, you might expect this to be in like Leviticus or Deuteronomy, maybe Song of Songs, right? That's the sexy book. I could also imagine this being in like 1 Corinthians when Paul is really writing home on the Corinthians for misbehaving out, right? And no, they actually pulled, of all places, from the book of Job. So Job says, I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a young woman. And then he goes on later in that same chapter to not just say that was the promise he made, but that he actually pulled it off. And in the book, they go into more detail about, God really upholds Job when, in the beginning of the book, when Satan's wandering around and God says, have you considered Job? Like, he's a good man. I'm pretty proud of him, right? So this is an interesting idea, making a promise with your eyes, treating your eyes as if they were not just an extension of you, but like another party. And actually, this was something that I heard a counselor say a long time ago that I liked. They said, you are not an elemental construct. Like if you got inside your head, you would just not be one thing the whole way through. You are insanely complicated. You would not be like, what's a good example? All right, here's some nerdy examples. In Doctor Strange, they like push your spirit out of your body, right? And it looks like, it just looks like you, just now you're transparent. And it's like, no, you wouldn't look like that. If you got inside you, it would look more like the inside of Riley and Inside Out. There's a whole bunch of little people in there, and they all have different ideas of what's going on, and they fight with each other, and they have different desires and different methods. And it's like, that's how you are inside. You're not an elemental, simple thing. You are made the way the counselor put it was, you have a personality, and your personality is made up of a bunch of sub-personalities. And you can picture them like a council table, and they all fight with each other. And sometimes they work together when things are going well. Anyways, the point being we can try to treat our eyes as a whole nother individual. As one of the people on our team that we're going to work with. So the big thing we're going to focus on is, in this book, their idea of bouncing your eyes. All right? And I'm going to read for a while straight from the book here. So strap in. All right. Every Man's Battle, Chapter 11. Excuse me. The problem is that your eyes have always bounced toward the sexual, and you've probably made no attempt to end this habit. To combat it, you need to build a reflex action by training your eyes to immediately bounce away from the sexual, like the jerk of your hand away from a hot stove. Let's repeat that for emphasis. When your eyes bounce toward a woman, they must bounce away immediately. But why must the bounce be immediate? After all, you might argue, a glance isn't the same thing as lusting. If we define lusting as staring open-mouthed until drool pools at your feet, then yes, a glance isn't the same as lusting. But if we define lusting as any look that creates a little chemical high, that little pop, then we have something a little bit more difficult to measure. This chemical high happens more quickly than you realize. I want to interrupt myself really quick here and just point out, because I've totally been in this place, the rationalization place of like, really, is it really that important that you look away that fast? Does it have to happen immediately? And I think the response is, well, are you getting something out of the quick little look or not? And if you're not getting anything, then it should be easy and not a big deal to give up because you're not getting anything out of it. But if you are getting something out of it, well, then there you go. You are getting something out of it, aren't you? All right, back to the book. In our experience, he's talking about the gentleman who wrote this book. Drawing the line at immediate is clean and easy for your mind and eyes to understand. This line in the sand seems to work effectively. So, how do we train this new bouncing reflex? Well, for openers, the habit of what your eyes look at is no different from any other habit. Since experts say that anything done consistently for 21 days becomes a new habit, you must find some way to consistently bounce your eyes over time. When you start bouncing your eyes, your body will fight against you in peculiar, unexpected ways. Sexual sin has an addictive nature, and your body will not want to give up its pleasures. You'll have to creatively respond in your quest for purity, and you do that through these two logical steps. Number 1, study yourself. How and where are you attacked most? And number 2, define your defense for each of the greatest enemies you've identified. This should seem familiar. We've talked about this. Know yourself, figure out where the enemy is attacking your weak spots. Your first step is listing your own greatest enemies. What are the most obvious and prolific sources of sensual images apart from your wife? Where do you look most often? Where are you weakest? And we're going to get into this a little bit deeper here. But we're going to get into some actual real examples and talk through. So he says, I had no problem coming up with a list of my 6 biggest areas of weakness. They are, number 1, lingerie ads in magazines. Number 2, female joggers. Number 3, billboards showing scantily clad women. 4, any beer or shampoo or razor commercials, anything like that. Number 5, movies rated PG-13 or higher. And his number 6, receptionists with low cut or tight blouses. So he asks, what are your main areas of weakness? In choosing them, remember that they must be areas from which you visually draw sexual satisfaction. Some men make the mistake of choosing non-visual weaknesses for this list. For instance, one man who we counseled initially included the following 3 things on his list. He said, showers, being home alone, and working late. We can all understand why these are troublesome. In the shower, you're nude with warm water cascading down your body. When you're home alone, no one is around to discover you. When you're working late, you feel sorry for yourself and need comfort. But such weak spots needn't be targeted if you train your eyes to bounce and eliminate the visual stimuli. With no food for the mental fancies, the sexual fever that draws your mind to sin in these situations will be broken. These situations will lose their power naturally. Real quick, I want to say in a different part of the book, they talk about taking oxygen away from a fire or fuel away from a fire, right? If you cut off the fuel support, no matter how hot the fire is, if it runs out of fuel, it runs out of fuel. And so they're talking about the visual images that we see in our very sexual culture as being things that you can take and store in your memories and can play around in your brain and eventually lead to relapses. So let's keep going. He came up with a list of 6 areas of struggles there. We're just going to go over 2 because they're pretty lengthy, but I think going over them gives you practical examples of how do we approach these problems. So he says, I can't define the best defense for your weaknesses, but let me share mine so you get a feel for the process. So first one was lingerie ads. Lingerie advertisements were my worst enemy and remained difficult to control for quite some time. I was successfully bouncing my eyes in every other area long before I had total victory here. Why? Those ad inserts were the most sexually satisfying images of them all, and from time to time I hit the mother lode, quote unquote. A swimsuit feature or an exercise feature illustrated with, well, you can imagine. Not only did I train my eyes to bounce away from such print ads, I also trained myself not to pick them up in the first place. My defense was to establish a number of rules to keep these images out of my hands before my eyes had a chance to see them. So, these are his rules. You don't have to adopt them, but to give you an idea. Rule number 1. When my hand reached for a magazine or insert, if I sensed in even the slightest way that my underlying motive was to see something sensual, I forfeited my right to pick up that magazine or insert. Forever. To be honest, this didn't work well at first. Even though sensing my motive was easy, forfeiting my right to pick it up was not. My flesh simply ignored my spirit, shouting, "Shut up! I want this and I'll have it." My flesh won time after time. But as I began to succeed in the other 5 areas, my hatred for the sin grew, and as it grew, my will and discipline grew stronger. I never gave up, and the lingerie ads finally failed to ensnare me. Rule number 2. If a magazine had an overtly sensual female on the cover, I tore off the cover and threw it away. Mail order clothing catalogs or swimsuit magazines with sensual cover pictures can sit on your coffee table, drawing your eyes all month long. Now, I ask you this. What if a full-breasted woman in a teensy-weensy yellow polka dot bikini came to your home and sat down on your coffee table and said, "I'll just sit here a while, but I promise to leave by the end of the month"? Would you let her stay to catch your eye every time you walked in the room? I don't think so. So why do you leave her there in picture form? Once I remember my wife asking, "What's been happening to all our magazine covers?" But that's how I handled the problem. And today, she happily grants me full censorship rights. Rule number 3. If I was genuinely looking for sale prices on camping equipment or tools and department store inserts, I would allow myself to pick up the insert, but I forced myself to start looking from the back. Don't ask me how I know, but the lingerie ads are usually found on pages 2 and 3. The camping, automotive, and tool ads are on the last pages. By opening the insert from the rear, I avoided seeing the young models entirely. When a sensual image snuck up on me, even though my motives for leafing through the magazine were proper, I kept the normal covenant to bounce my eyes immediately. So that was his first one on advertisements. His second one here is on female joggers. It says, whenever I approached a roadside jogger while driving my car, my eyes fixed on her, appreciating her beauty. But trying to look away from a jogger creates a problem. I have to look away completely from the road not to see her. That's driving dangerously, even where I live. After all, I didn't want to run anybody over. Studying the situation, I found a solution. Rather than look completely away, I could look to the opposite side of the road. I discovered that it was impossible to lust with only my peripheral vision, so I used this to my advantage. My body began to fight back in some interesting ways. First, my brain argued fiercely with me. If you'll keep this up, you'll cause a wreck. I considered this argument and answered, you and I know that's highly unlikely. However, and this is one I want to draw your attention to, my body's second attempt to stop me was very peculiar. Whenever I saw a jogger and reflexively looked away, my mind would trick me into believing I recognized the individual, prompting a second look. My mind was so good at this that nearly every female jogger I saw reminded me of someone I knew. Talk about irritating. It took me a while to stop falling for that deception. Then my brain tried another trick. As I passed the jogger without a direct look, I would momentarily relax. In the same moment, my brain took advantage of my lowered guard by ordering my eyes to glance into the rearview mirror for a more direct look. That really burned me up. I had to learn not to drop my guard after passing, and in time, that trick faded away as well. Whenever I was taken in by one of these tricks, I'd bark to myself in sharp rebuke. You've made a covenant with your eyes. You can't do that anymore. In the first 2 weeks, I must have said it 1,000,000 times. But the repeated confessions of truth eventually worked a transformation in me. So, there's our first tool that I have found helpful and that I encourage people to start with. Again, there's lots more tools in that book, but this is, I think, this is the the kiddie pool version. Hey, we made it to week 4. I'm finally going to quote C.S. Lewis. He says, when you go to learn mathematics, you don't start with calculus. You start with basic addition. And so if we're going to talk about mastering our sexualities, it's like we're not going to start with the hardest battles. We're going to start with the most basic first. And the most basic is, are you looking at things you ought not to? All right, let's work on that. So there's our first tool. Our second tool is coming from Pure Desire, and I really like this story. As he tells it in the book, he was flying his fighter jet one day, and something went wrong. He doesn't get into details of what specifically went wrong in the book, but something went wrong. All the alarms in the cockpit start going off, and his brain freezes, right? Deer in the headlights. In his mind, he's just absolutely frozen. Can't think. Well, he can think. His brain is thinking like, this is it. I don't know what to do. We're going to die. We have seconds to react, and this is it. That's what his brain is doing. Well, his brain is freaking out. His body leaps into action and starts flicking the right switches and pushing the right buttons and pulling the right levers, and he drops down to a safer level, and he ends up saving the plane. Now, that's probably not surprising to you, because these things cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, right? They don't let new pilots get into them without running the simulations, right? They have to be able to react to any emergency that might come up in their sleep, blindfolded, right? They have to be able to react to these emergencies perfectly before they're even allowed to look at a real plane, right? Like that's our expectation, because these things aren't cheap. You have to know how to react to emergencies. Like, not with your brain. Your body's just going to take over and do it for you because you've done this emergency so many times. All right, that's not surprising with fighter pilots. And so our second tool that I encourage everybody to look into, you should all know, but maybe haven't applied it to this area of your life, which is, don't wait until you're in an emergency to think about what you're going to do when you're in an emergency, right? Don't wait until you are in the throes of temptation. Don't wait until you are just emotionally overwhelmed or exhausted. Don't wait till the moment when your hormones are going crazy. It's like, you know those times come, right? You know in advance, like, these are the battles that have come at you in the past, and you're not expecting Satan to just give up today. So you know those same battles are going to come in the future. Okay, start thinking about how you're going to tackle those problems now. Think about it now when your mind is clear. Or if your mind isn't clear right now, think about it when your mind is clear, right? Don't wait until you're in the moment, because then you're not going to be able to think straight, and you're going to default to like, hey, how have I always dealt with this problem in the past? And it's like, because I know that works. Well, no, that's what we're trying to get out of. So don't wait until an emergency to think about what you're going to do in an emergency. I think that's good general advice, just in general. Our last tool also comes from Pure Desire, and we're going to talk about a system they call FASTER, which is a way to gauge yourself. This is not just unique to pornography or sexual problems. This is a pattern that psychologists see in lots of addictions. Well, I say lots. Pretty much all addictions at one point or another. I have a problem with making universal statements, but 95% of the time, relapses follow this pattern, and so it's worth knowing about. So you start initially outside of the relapse pattern. FASTER is an acronym, and we're going to go through each of the letters. Initially, you start outside that. You start out in a proper relationship with God and others. Like, you aren't in the relapse spiral yet. The first letter is forgetting priorities. I'm going to read right from Pure Desire here, chapter 8. One of the first signs of a possible relapse is a shift in plans or priorities. At this stage, the individual begins to believe in his or her present circumstances and moves away from trusting in God. They may begin to keep secrets, spend less time with God, avoid support or accountability people, engage in superficial conversations, break promises or recovery commitments, or neglect family. Forgetting priorities will lead to or cause anxiety. At this stage, the person experiences a growing background noise of undefined fear and draws energy from his or her emotions. They may begin to worry and become increasingly fearful or resentful towards others. The person may also replay past negative thoughts in his or her mind, engage in fantasy, blame others for the way they feel, judge others' motives, engage in perfectionism, and make goals or lists that he or she can't possibly complete. Individuals at this stage may experience sleep problems, have trouble concentrating, seek or create drama, or look for medications to control his or her pain, sleep, or weight control problems. Anxiety next leads to speeding up. In this phase, the person experiencing a relapse attempts to outrun the anxiety he or she is feeling by consciously or subconsciously focusing on a variety of other priorities. The individual at this stage becomes overly busy and driven and has a difficult time slowing down to relax. They may skip meals, work long hours, stay up late at night, consume increased amounts of caffeine or sugar, or over-exercise to keep up the pace. The person may find it difficult to turn off his or her thoughts or identify what they are feeling, experience dramatic mood swings, have trouble being alone, and get easily distracted when attempting to listen to others. Speeding up leads to being ticked off. Someone really wanted this acronym to work. A person at this stage begins to use anger as a way of numbing the pain that they are experiencing. The individual actually begins to get an adrenaline high from aggression and will react above and beyond what any given situation warrants. Traits of those at this stage include increased sarcasm, all or nothing thinking, irrational thinking, defensiveness, inability to forgive, sense of superiority, procrastination, or feelings of isolation and resentment. The individual will assume an "I don't need anyone" attitude and push others away. He or she may also experience physical side effects, such as headaches and digestive problems. Being ticked off then leads to being exhausted. By this point, the individual's neurochemicals are nearly depleted, making the pain that the person has been seeking to avoid nearly unavoidable. As the individual comes off the adrenaline high from aggression, he or she begins to experience a loss of physical and emotional energy. Depression soon follows, and the person may experience feelings of panic, confusion, hopelessness, helplessness, and sheer exhaustion. He or she may sleep too much or too little, cry for no reason, quote-unquote no reason, become forgetful, submit to pessimistic or suicidal thoughts, and crave old coping behaviors, such as sex, drugs, or alcohol. Those at this stage often seek old unhealthy patterns of behavior, isolate themselves, miss work, become increasingly irritable, or experience a loss of appetite. This leads to the final stage, relapse. When a person relapses, they return to a place that the individual swore he or she would never go to again. At this point, the person is out of control and is lost in his or her addiction. He or she has given up and given in lying to self and to others, and cannot manage without his or her coping behaviors, at least for now. The result is the reinforcement of shame, guilt, and condemnation, and feelings of abandonment and isolation. Here's the important part we want to focus on, though. It takes an individual a variety of time, but they see often it takes about 3 to 6 weeks to progress through all the stages. You can therefore determine where you are on the FASTER scale by answering where you are in each of these bullet points. All right? You can start asking yourself, how am I feeling right now? Are you feeling anxious? Are you feeling angry? And are you feeling, was the first one, forgetting priorities. Like, does life just start to feel off? And you can start to get a feel for where you are in this pattern. Conversely, it's helpful, if you do fall off the wagon, to start looking backwards and saying, what happened yesterday? What happened 3 days ago? What happened a week ago? What happened 2 weeks ago? And try to start tracking down what actually sparks relapses, because it's incorrect to think of, oh, this happened today and it set me off and I relapsed. It's like, no, I don't think that's how the enemy works. I would not go so far as to give the enemy the benefit of a virtue and say they have patience, but at the very least, the enemy knows how to play the long game. They're perfectly willing to, well, let's say this. They would rather you sin today, but if they can't get you to sin today, they're content with getting you to sin in a couple weeks and starting that process. All right, so those are the tools I brought tonight. Just think about practicing bouncing your eyes. When things come on the TV, you immediately look away. Try to build that reflex. Think about your emergencies before they show up and start looking at yourself and trying to figure out what are your patterns that lead up to relapses. And I think that's where we'll stop today.